The white cotton of the dress felt like a shroud. It was simple, unadorned, the way a virtuous bride's dress ought to be. But to Clara, it was a costume for a play she had never wished to be in. Her hands, scrubbed raw and pale, trembled as she smoothed the fabric over her hips for the 10th time. From the small, cracked mirror in the back room of the church, a stranger stared back at her. A girl with wide, haunted eyes the color of a stormy sky. Hair the shade of dried corn silk pinned up so tightly it pulled at her scalp, and a mouth set in a line so thin it might shatter. This was her wedding day. The thought did not bring a flutter of joy, only a cold, heavy stone in the pit of her stomach. She was to be Mrs. Jebediah Stone, wife to the son of the wealthiest rancher in Redemption Creek. It was a future most women in this dusty, God-fearing town would have given their right arm for. A life of security, of plenty, a life clean and new. That was the promise Reverend Harlan had made her. He had found her months ago, a ghost of a girl wandering the barren lands outside the Blackwater Gulch mining camp, her spirit as tattered as her dress. He had spoken of God's grace, of redemption, of a chance to wash away the past and be reborn in the light of a respectable life. He had brought her here, to this town, and cloaked her in piety, presenting her as a timid orphan of good breeding who had fallen on hard times, a pure, untouched flower ready for planting in the fertile soil of the Stone family fortune. He had lied. He knew what had happened in Blackwater Gulch. He knew of the grime that clung not just to the skin but to the soul. He knew the horrors she had survived, the things done to her in the shadows of the saloons and the cramped, dirty tents by men whose faces she forced herself to forget every morning. He had heard her confession, whispered through tears in the dead of night, and had patted her hand, telling her that her secret was safe with God and with him. He had called it her penance, this marriage, a way to repay the Lord for her survival. But Clara knew what it was. She was a commodity. Her perceived purity, a bargaining chip he had used to ingratiate himself with the powerful Stone family. A sharp rap on the door made her jump, a gasp catching in her throat. "Clara, child!" "It is time." It was Mrs. Stone, her future mother-in-law. Her voice was as starched and rigid as her high-collared dresses. Clara pressed a trembling hand to her chest, trying to still the frantic beating of her heart. "Yes, ma'am, I am ready." Another lie. She was not ready. She felt like a lamb being led to slaughter, the white dress her sacrificial fleece. She opened the door to see Martha Stone standing there, a mountain of a woman whose gaze was a physical weight, her eyes, small and sharp, raked over Clara from head to toe, searching for any flaw, any imperfection. She gave a curt, satisfied nod. Clara looked the part. At least, delicate, biddable, pure. "Jebediah is waiting. Do not keep him so." "Mrs." Stone said, her tone leaving no room for argument. She turned and led the way, her heavy footsteps echoing on the wooden floorboards. Clara followed, her own steps nearly silent. The small church was packed, every pew filled with the stern, watchful faces of the people of Redemption Creek. They were a hard people, carved from the unforgiving land they inhabited. Their lives were governed by a strict code of honor, work, and faith, and they had little tolerance for those who deviated. As she walked down the narrow aisle, she could feel their collective gaze upon her, 100 pairs of eyes assessing her worth. She kept her head bowed, her focus on the worn toes of her simple leather shoes, a gift from the Reverend. At the altar, Reverend Harlan stood beaming, his round face flushed with success. Beside him stood Jebediah Stone. He was a tall, broad-shouldered young man with his father's hard jaw and his mother's small, assessing eyes. He looked handsome in his new suit, but his mouth was set in a petulant line. He had not wanted this marriage any more than she had. It was a transaction orchestrated by his father and the preacher, a way to secure a docile and respectable wife to produce heirs for the Stone dynasty. He looked at Clara not with affection, but with the cool appraisal of a man examining livestock. She took her place beside him, her hands cold and clammy. The scent of dry dust and old wood filled the air, mingled with the faint, cloying sweetness of the wildflowers clutched in her hand. Reverend Harlan cleared his throat, and a hush fell over the congregation. "Dearly beloved," he began, his voice booming in the small space, "we are gathered here today in the sight of God to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." Clara's mind drifted. His words were a meaningless drone, a river of sound flowing past her. She thought of the open sky, the feel of wind on her face, the freedom of being unseen. Here, she was a specimen under glass, every part of her scrutinized. She risked a glance at the crowd and saw Elias Stone, the family patriarch, sitting in the front pew. He was a formidable man with a granite face and eyes that missed nothing. He was staring at her, his expression one of proud ownership. He had bought and paid for a perfect, unblemished daughter-in-law, and he was pleased with his purchase. The thought sent a chill down her spine. It was then that she heard it, a faint sound, no more than a rustle of fabric and a sibilant whisper from the back of the church. It was a sound that should have been lost in the Reverend's sermon, but to Clara's heightened senses, it was as loud as a gunshot. Her head snapped up. She saw two women in the back pew, their heads bent together. One of them was a woman she vaguely recognized, someone who passed through Blackwater Gulch selling tonics and remedies. The woman's eyes met Clara's for a fleeting second, and in them, Clara saw a flash of cruel, knowing triumph. The whisper began to travel. Like a snake slithering through dry grass, it moved from one person to the next, a ripple of murmurs spreading through the silent congregation. Heads turned, eyes widened. The assessing looks turned to something else, something harder, colder, disdain. Reverend Harlan faltered, his booming voice trailing off as he noticed the disturbance. Jebediah shifted beside her, his body stiffening. "What is it?" he hissed, his eyes darting towards his parents. Martha Stone's face had gone rigid, her lips pressed into a bloodless line. Elias Stone was leaning forward, his ear inclined towards a man whispering urgently to him. Clara watched as the patriarch's face transformed, the look of satisfaction curdling into one of thunderous rage. He rose slowly to his feet, his presence silencing the entire church. Every eye was now on him. And then, they all turned to Clara. "Is it true?" Elias Stone's voice was a low growl that filled the sacred space with a profane menace. Reverend Harlan's face had gone pale and sweaty. "Mr. Stone, I do not know what you mean. This is a house of God. Let us proceed." "Do not speak to me of God, you charlatan!" Stone roared, pointing a trembling, accusatory finger at Clara. "Is it true what they say of this creature? That she comes from that filth pit, Blackwater Gulch? That she is no better than a common whore?" The words struck Clara with the force of a physical blow. The air left her lungs, the church, the faces, the altar. It all blurred into a dizzying swirl of color and light. She could feel Jebediah recoil from her as if she were diseased. "Well?" his father demanded, his voice cracking like a whip. "Speak!" Clara could not find her voice. Her throat was a knot of shame and terror. She looked at Reverend Harlan, her eyes pleading with him to deny it, to save her, to uphold the lie he had so carefully constructed. But the preacher only wrung his hands, his gaze fixed on the floor, his face a mask of guilty fear. His silence was her confession. A wave of revulsion washed over the congregation. The pity some might have felt was drowned out by the self-righteous disgust of the majority. They had been duped. This soiled dove had been presented to them as a paragon of virtue. Jebediah stared at her, his face a canvas of disbelief and fury. This was not just a broken contract. It was a public humiliation. He, the son of Elias Stone, had almost married tainted goods. His pride, more valuable to him than any dowry, had been wounded. "You lied," he whispered, his voice shaking with a rage that was both cold and violent. "You let me stand here. You let my family welcome you." He took a step back, his face contorting in disgust. Then he did something that shattered the last vestiges of Clara's composure. He gathered saliva in his mouth and spat, the glob landing on the pure white cotton of her dress, just over her heart. It was a small, dark stain, but it felt as if he had branded her. "You are ruined," he snarled, the words loud and clear in the dead silence of the church. "You are nothing. Get out of my sight." For a moment, no one moved. The world seemed to stop, frozen in that tableau of judgment and hate. Clara stood there, the spittle on her dress, the weight of 100 hostile stares pressing down on her, the word ruined echoing in the chamber of her soul. And then, something inside her broke, a dam of grief and despair that had been holding for months, for years, finally burst. A strangled sob escaped her lips. She turned, her borrowed shoes slipping on the polished floor. She did not look at anyone. She could not bear to see their faces. She only knew she had to run. She ran down the aisle, her simple veil tearing loose and floating to the floor behind her like a discarded piece of her shattered dreams. She fumbled with the heavy church doors, her fingers clumsy and numb, and then she was outside, gasping in the harsh, bright sunlight. The main street of Redemption Creek was a wide, dusty expanse baked hard by the relentless sun. Without thinking, she kicked off the tight shoes that had pinched her feet and ran. The hot, gritty earth burned the soles of her feet, sharp stones and bits of glass cutting into her tender skin. But she did not feel the pain. The only pain she felt was the gaping wound in her chest. She ran barefoot and in her stained wedding dress, a spectacle of shame for the whole town to see. Faces appeared in windows. Men stopped in the street to stare. Women pulled their children close as she passed, as if her disgrace were a contagion. She heard their murmurs, their righteous condemnation. Their silence was as loud as any shout. No one stepped forward to help. No one offered a word of comfort. She was an outcast, a pariah. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs felt like lead. She ran past the saloon, past the blacksmith's forge, past the last crooked house on the edge of town. She did not stop until the sounds of Redemption Creek had faded behind her, replaced by the whisper of the wind through the sagebrush. The sun began to dip below the jagged horizon, painting the sky in brutal strokes of orange and purple. The heat of the day bled away, and the chill of the high desert night began to seep into the air. Clara finally stumbled to a halt, her body racked with shudders that were part of exhaustion, part of sorrow. She collapsed in a heap at the base of a lonely, twisted juniper tree, the white of her dress a ghostly blot against the darkening land. She was alone, utterly and completely alone. The preacher's promises of redemption were ash in her mouth. The hope for a new life, a clean slate, was a cruel joke. They had seen her not as a survivor, but as something damaged beyond repair, ruined. The word was a poison, seeping into every part of her. As darkness fell completely, wrapping the world in a blanket of cold, silent ink, Clara curled into a tight ball, her arms wrapped around her shaking body. The thin cotton dress offered no protection against the biting wind. She was cold, she was hurt, and she was terrified. The wilderness was full of dangers, coyotes, snakes, men worse than either. But at that moment, she did not care. Let them come. Let the cold take her. It would be a kinder end than the one she had just escaped. Tears she had held back for so long finally came, hot and silent at first, then turning into ragged, heartbroken sobs that tore through her small frame. She cried for the girl she had once been, for the woman she would never get to be. She cried for the injustice of a world that punished the victim and celebrated the cruel. She cried until she had no tears left, until she was just a hollow, shivering shell of a human being. It was the sound that reached her first, a steady, rhythmic clopping of hooves on the hard-packed earth. It was slow, unhurried, her head jerked up, her body tensing with a familiar, gut-wrenching fear. She tried to make herself smaller, to melt into the shadows of the juniper tree. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of terror. Who would be out here, in the middle of nowhere, in the dead of night? A shape emerged from the gloom, a large silhouette against the star-dusted sky. A man on a horse. The horse was big and dark, and the man atop it seemed carved from the same rugged material as the landscape around them. He reined his horse to a stop a few yards away, the animal snorting softly, its warm breath misting in the cold air. Clara held her breath, willing herself to be invisible. The man was silent for a long moment, just watching her. She could not see his face clearly in the dark, only the outline of a wide-brimmed hat and broad shoulders. "You will freeze to death out here," he said. His voice was low and gravelly, like stones grinding together. It was not unkind, but it was devoid of any warmth. It was the voice of a man who did not waste words. She did not answer, only pressed herself harder against the rough bark of the tree. He was a stranger, a man, and men were the source of all the pain in her world. He swung himself down from the saddle with a weary grace. He was tall, and he moved with a slow, deliberate confidence that spoke of a life lived on the edge. As he drew closer, the faint starlight illuminated a weathered face, a square jaw covered in dark stubble, and eyes that seemed to hold the darkness of the night within them. He was not handsome in the way Jebediah Stone had been. His face was a map of hard miles and harder fights, creased with lines around his eyes and a faint, white scar that cut through his left eyebrow. He looked dangerous. He stopped a safe distance from her, his gaze taking in her torn and dirty wedding dress, her bare, bleeding feet, the tracks of tears on her dusty cheeks. He saw everything, but his expression remained unreadable. This was Luke Morgan, an ex-bounty hunter who had made a living tracking down men far more dangerous than the ones in Redemption Creek. He was just passing through, on his way to nowhere in particular. His only companion, the horse beneath him, and the ghosts that rode on his shoulders. He had seen the lights of the town and had deliberately skirted it. He had no use for towns, for preachers, or for the hypocritical piety of settled folk. He preferred the clean, honest brutality of the wilderness. He had no interest in getting involved in anyone's troubles. He had learned the hard way that a helping hand was often the one that got burned. His plan was to ride on, to leave the shivering girl to her fate. It was not his concern. The West was full of broken people, and a man could not save them all. A man was a fool to even try. But he did not ride on. He stood there, watching her tremble, and saw something in her wide, terrified eyes that resonated with a broken part of his own soul. It was not pity he felt. Pity was a useless emotion. It was a flicker of recognition. He knew that look. It was the look of an animal caught in a trap, chewing off its own leg to get free. It was the look of someone who had seen the absolute worst of the world and had somehow, impossibly, survived. With a sigh that sounded like a curse, he turned away from her and began to unsaddle his horse. The decision was made, against all his better instincts. He worked with an efficient, practiced economy of motion, pulling his bedroll and a small sack of supplies from the horse. He gathered dry brush and, with a flint and steel, coaxed a small flame into existence. The fire crackled to life, a small circle of warmth and light in the vast, indifferent darkness. He took a worn wool blanket from his bedroll and walked back over to where she huddled. He did not speak. He simply dropped the blanket near her, then retreated to the other side of the fire. Clara watched him, her fear warring with a desperate need for the warmth he offered. Slowly, cautiously, as if expecting a blow, she reached out a trembling hand and pulled the blanket towards her. It was coarse and smelled of horse, leather, and wood smoke, but it was thick and warm. She wrapped it around her shoulders, the simple comfort of it almost making her weep again. Luke sat on his heels by the fire, seemingly ignoring her. He took a piece of jerky from his sack and a canteen of water, setting them on the ground between them, a silent invitation. Shame washed over Clara, hot and fierce. She pulled the blanket tighter, hiding her face in its folds. She was a disgrace, a charity case, taking warmth and supplies from a stranger in the dead of night while wearing the tatters of her own humiliation. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice so soft it was almost lost in the crackle of the flames. Luke grunted in acknowledgement, his eyes on the fire. He did not ask her what had happened. He did not ask her name or where she was from. He did not ask why she was out here alone in a wedding dress. He simply sat in silence, a sentinel on the other side of the fire, offering a space of quiet respite. But he was watching. He saw the way she flinched when a coyote howled in the distance. He saw how her whole body went rigid when the wind rustled the branches of the juniper tree above them. He saw that she was a wounded creature, coiled tight with a fear so deep it had become a part of her. And he knew, with a certainty that settled in his bones like the desert cold, that this moment of quiet charity was going to cost him more than just a blanket and a piece of jerky. The world was a raw, aching canvas of brown and blue. For days, this was all Clara saw, the endless, dusty earth beneath and the vast, unforgiving sky above. She sat in front of Luke on his big roan gelding, her back stiff, careful not to lean against the hard wall of his chest. The rhythmic sway of the horse was a constant, monotonous motion that seemed to be rocking the very thoughts in her head into a dull, manageable stupor. He had not asked her to ride. At dawn, after a nearly silent night spent on opposite sides of a dying fire, he had simply packed his meager belongings, saddled the horse, and then looked at her, his gaze unwavering. He had extended a calloused hand. It was not a gesture of kindness, but of practicality. She could not keep up on foot, and he had made the silent decision that he was not leaving her behind. She had taken his hand, her small fingers disappearing in his rough grasp, and allowed him to pull her up onto the horse's broad back. Now, she watched the landscape roll by. Jagged mountains clawed at the horizon, their peaks hazy in the distance. Dry riverbeds snaked through the plains like pale, sun-bleached bones. The silence between them was a heavy thing, filled with the creak of worn leather, the soft thud of hooves on dirt, and the sigh of the wind. Luke did not speak, and Clara was grateful for it. Words were dangerous. They could be twisted and used as weapons, or they could be empty promises that shattered like glass. Silence was safe. She stared at her hands, resting on the pommel of the saddle. They were chapped and scratched, the nails broken. These were not the hands of a rancher's bride. They were the hands of a survivor. Luke noticed the way she stared at nothing, her eyes fixed on some distant point in the past. He saw the tension in her slim shoulders, the way she held her breath whenever a hawk cried overhead. She was like a wild thing, poised for flight at the slightest provocation. Yet there was a stillness in her, a deep and profound weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. It was on the third day that she finally spoke of it. They had stopped to water the horse at a sluggish, muddy creek, the only sign of life for miles. As Luke checked the horse's hooves, Clara knelt by the water's edge, staring at her own fractured reflection. "Blackwater Gulch," she said, her voice a dry rasp, so quiet he almost did not hear it. He stopped what he was doing and looked at her. He did not ask a question, just waited. "That is the name of the mining camp," she continued, her gaze still fixed on the water. "Where I was before." She picked up a small, smooth stone, turning it over and over in her palm. "It is not a town. It is a place where men go to dig riches from the earth, and to forget they have souls." She told him then, not all at once, but in broken pieces, the words coming slowly, as if she were pulling them from a deep and painful well. She spoke of the hunger, the cold, the desperation that had driven her there after her parents had succumbed to fever on the trail west. She spoke of the leering eyes of the men, of the way they looked at a lone, unprotected woman. She did not speak of specific acts, of the violence that had stolen her innocence. She did not have to. The shame and horror were etched into the very cadence of her speech, in the long pauses where she struggled for breath. She spoke of it as a thing that had happened to her, an ordeal she had endured, a stain that she feared would never wash away. "There were so many of them," she whispered, her voice trembling. "And I was alone." She told him how she had finally escaped, running into the wilderness with nothing but the clothes on her back, running until she had collapsed, just as she had outside Redemption Creek. And that was where Reverend Harlan had found her. "He said he was my salvation," she said, a bitter, hollow sound in her throat that was almost a laugh. "He spoke of God's mercy. He took me in, gave me clean clothes and food. He told me I could be reborn." She finally looked up from the water, her stormy eyes meeting Luke's. "He did not want to save my soul. He wanted to sell my new life. He knew. I told him everything. He knew what I had survived, and he called it a dark chapter, one that was to be closed and forgotten. He told the stones I was a preacher's daughter from the East, an orphan. He told them I was pure." The word hung in the air between them, ugly and sharp. Luke's face, which had been a mask of stoic neutrality, hardened. A muscle twitched in his jaw. He had seen men like Harlan before, men who used God as a shield to hide the rot in their own hearts, men who preyed on the weak and called it providence. A flicker of something cold and dangerous lit his dark eyes, a brief, contained inferno of rage. Clara saw it and mistook it for judgment. Her face crumpled, and she looked away, ashamed. "I know I should have told them the truth, but I was so tired of running, and I thought maybe he was right. Maybe I could just pretend to be that girl, the girl they wanted." Luke walked over to the creek and crouched beside her. He did not touch her. He just stared out at the barren land. "You do not owe them the truth," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You do not owe anything to anyone, least of all to a pack of hypocrites who would judge a person for surviving." He tossed a stone into the water, watching the ripples spread. "The world is full of people who will try to tell you what you are. They will put a name to you to make themselves feel clean. It does not make it true." His words were simple, stark, but they landed in Clara's soul like seeds falling on parched earth. No one had ever spoken to her like that. No one had ever suggested that her survival was not a source of shame, but simply a fact. She looked at this rough, weathered man, a stranger who had no reason to care, and felt the first tentative loosening of the knot of guilt in her chest. They rode on. The conversation was not mentioned again, but something had shifted between them. The silence was no longer as heavy. It was more companionable, as if the shared weight of her story had created a space they could both inhabit. The next day, the sky turned a sickly yellow-gray. The wind, which had been a constant, dry whisper, began to howl, picking up sand and grit and hurling it at them. A dust storm. Luke cursed under his breath, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of shelter. The air grew thick and dark, the sun blotted out by a swirling, choking cloud of earth. It became hard to breathe, hard to see. The world was reduced to a maelstrom of stinging sand and roaring wind. Through the haze, Luke spotted it, the dark, skeletal frame of a building, a long-abandoned barn or homestead, its roof half collapsed. He urged the horse forward, shielding his face with his arm. Clara huddled behind him, her face buried in the coarse fabric of his shirt. They stumbled inside just as the full fury of the storm hit, the wind shrieking through the broken slats of the walls like a banshee. The barn was little more than a wreck, filled with the scent of decay and ancient hay. But it was shelter. They huddled together in a corner, away from the worst of the wind, listening to the storm rage outside. Dust seeped through every crack, coating everything in a fine, brown powder. It was in their hair, their mouths, their eyes. Hours passed, The roaring of the wind was a constant, deafening assault in the suffocating darkness of the barn, with the world outside trying to tear itself apart. A strange sense of calm settled over Clara. Here, in this maelstrom, the judgments of Redemption Creek seemed small and far away. There was only this present moment, this shared struggle for survival. When the wind finally began to die down, Luke stirred. He pulled a small, dented metal flask from his saddlebag. "Water," he said, his voice raspy with dust. He uncorked it and took a small sip before handing it to her. Clara's throat was painfully dry. She took the flask, her fingers brushing against his. His skin was rough and warm. She lifted the flask to her lips, the cool metal a relief. She drank, the water tasting of metal and salvation. She was about to hand it back when a sudden gust of wind tore a loose piece of the roof off with a loud, comical ripping sound. A shower of dust and old straw rained down on them. She looked at Luke, his hair and shoulders covered in debris. He looked back at her, a matching layer of dust frosting her own hair and eyelashes. A small, involuntary sound escaped her. A giggle. It was a foreign sound, one she had not heard from her own lips in what felt like a lifetime. The absurdity of it all, the stained wedding dress, the furious storm, the ruined barn. The two of them sitting there like dusty scarecrows. It struck her as suddenly, inexplicably funny. The giggle turned into a genuine laugh. It was not a loud laugh, but it was real, bubbling up from a place deep inside her that she thought had died. It was rusty and weak, but it was a sound of life. For a second, Luke looked startled. Then, the hard lines around his mouth softened almost imperceptibly, and the corner of his lip tilted upwards in what might have been the shadow of a smile. He took the flask from her, his gaze holding hers for a moment longer than necessary. In that moment, a bond was forged between them, silent and unspoken, tempered in the heart of the storm. As they continued their journey, the subtle deepening of their connection was marked not by words, but by small, quiet actions. One evening, as Clara sat by the fire mending a tear in the sleeve of Luke's shirt, a task she had taken upon herself without being asked, he found himself watching her. He watched the way the firelight caught the gold in her hair, the intense focus in her eyes as she pushed the needle through the rough fabric with careful, precise stitches. She was not delicate. He had thought her so at first, but he saw now that it was not true. There was a resilience in her, a core of tempered steel forged in a fire he could only imagine. He saw the bravery in that simple act of mending, of putting something broken back together. And she, in turn, would steal glances at him when he thought she was not looking. She watched him as he chopped wood for their fire, the muscles in his back and arms moving with a fluid, powerful grace. He was a part of this wilderness, as hard and self-sufficient as the landscape itself. But she saw more than just a rough exterior. She saw the way he gentled his voice when he spoke to his horse, the careful way he would bank the fire at night so it would last until morning. She saw a protector, a steady presence in a world that had offered her nothing but chaos. She started to feel a sense of safety with him that was entirely new, a quiet assurance that while he was near, the worst of the world would be kept at bay. After another week of travel, they saw the first signs of civilization again. A small, dusty town called Providence, nestled in a valley. They were low on supplies, and Luke knew they could not avoid it. "I will go," Clara said, her voice quiet but firm as they made camp on a ridge overlooking the town. I need to learn to do for myself again." Luke looked at her, his expression unreadable. He did not like the idea. Towns were cruel places, but he saw the resolve in her eyes, the need to reclaim some small piece of her own agency. He nodded curtly, handing her a few coins. "Just get flour and salt, nothing more. Do not talk to anyone more than you have to." She cleaned herself as best she could in a small stream, tying her hair back neatly. She was no longer wearing the ruined wedding dress. Luke had bought her a simple, sturdy calico dress and a pair of boots from a traveling peddler they had met on the trail. Dressed in these plain clothes, she hoped she could pass through the town unnoticed, just another traveler buying supplies. The town's main street was quiet. Clara walked with her head held high, forcing a confidence she did not feel. She found the general store, its windows displaying sacks of flour, tools, and bolts of cloth. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the door open. A bell jingled overhead. An oily-looking man with a slicked-back hair and a pencil-thin mustache stood behind the counter. He looked her up and down, his eyes lingering on her face. "Help you?" he asked, his tone laced with a bored familiarity. "Flour and salt, please," Clara said, keeping her voice steady. He scooped the flour into a sack, his movements slow. "Just passing through?" "Yes," she said, not wanting to engage. "Where you headed from?" he pressed, his curiosity piqued by this unfamiliar, pretty face. "From the east," she lied, placing the coins Luke had given her on the counter. "Is that so?" he said, a slow, unpleasant smile spreading across his face. "Funny. A fella rode through here yesterday from Redemption Creek. Told a story about a runaway bride, a girl named Clara." Clara's blood ran cold. She froze, her hand still on the counter. The shopkeeper's smile widened, becoming a sneer. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial, greasy whisper. He said she was not what she seemed, said she was damaged goods. The phrase hit her like a punch to the gut, stealing her breath. Damaged goods. Ruined. It was the same brand, the same vile judgment. She felt the blood drain from her face, the carefully constructed wall of her composure crumbling into dust. She could not speak, could not move. It was at that moment that the door to the store swung open so hard it slammed against the wall. Luke stood there, his large frame filling the doorway. His eyes, dark as thunderclouds, were fixed on the shopkeeper. He had seen the man's expression through the window. He had seen the look of utter devastation on Clara's face. He had heard the last poisonous words. He moved with a speed that was terrifying in a man his size. In 2 long strides, he was at the counter. He did not say a word. He simply reached across, grabbed a fistful of the shopkeeper's shirt, and hauled him over the wooden surface. The man yelped, his eyes wide with shock and fear. Luke's other hand clenched into a fist, and he drove it into the man's jaw with a sickening crunch. The shopkeeper crumpled to the floor, unconscious. Luke turned to Clara. Her face was as white as a sheet, her eyes wide with shock. He grabbed her arm, his grip firm but not harsh. "We are leaving," he said, his voice a low, furious growl. He dragged her from the store, leaving the coins and the supplies behind on the counter. That night, back at their camp, the silence was different. It was raw and painful. Clara sat huddled by the fire, her arms wrapped around her knees, staring into the flames. She had not cried in the town. She had been too shocked. But now, the tears came. They were not the wild, hysterical sobs of her wedding day. They were quiet, hopeless tears of pure frustration. They streamed down her face, tracing paths through the dust on her cheeks. "Will it ever end?" she whispered to the fire. "Will they ever stop seeing me as that, as something broken?" She looked up at Luke, her eyes pleading. Am I always to be running from that word? Luke sat across from her, his face grim, his hands clenched. He had wanted to do more than just punch that man. He had wanted to break him, to make him feel a fraction of the pain he had inflicted on her with his careless, cruel words. He looked at her now, at her tear-streaked face, and the rage in him gave way to a deep, aching protectiveness that was both unfamiliar and powerful. He rose and walked over to her, kneeling in the dirt beside her. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before he gently brushed a tear from her cheek with his thumb. His touch was surprisingly soft. "You are not what they call you," he said, his voice low and intense, forcing her to meet his gaze. The names they give you, the judgment they pass, that is their filth, not yours. He leaned closer, his dark eyes holding hers, willing her to believe him. You are what you survive. The past did not live in memories. For Luke, it lived in the quiet moments, ambushing him when his guard was down. It was a ghost that smelled of gunpowder and cheap whiskey, a phantom weight on his shoulders. He would be cleaning his revolver by the fire, the familiar, methodical clicks of the cylinder a comfort, and suddenly he would not be in the vast, open wilderness with Clara sleeping peacefully nearby. He would be back in a dusty, sun-baked street in the middle of the Texas Panhandle. The memory was always the same, sharp and cruel as a shard of glass in his mind. He was younger then, harder in some ways, softer in others. He had a reputation. Luke Morgan could track any man, and he always brought them in. It was a living, and he was good at it. It was a simple, brutal arithmetic of crime and punishment, and he had believed in it. He had believed in the law. His younger brother, Samuel, had not. Sam was all smiles and easy charm, with a dreamer's heart that was ill-suited to the harsh realities of their world. He saw the good in people, a flaw Luke had often warned him would get him killed. But Sam had idolized him, had seen the bounty hunting not as a grim trade, but as a grand adventure. He had begged to come along on one last job, just one, before he settled down to marry his sweetheart. The bounty was on a pair of brothers, the Cogan brothers, wanted for robbing a stagecoach and killing a guard. The pay was good, and the job seemed straightforward. Luke had said no 12 times, but Sam had a way of wearing him down, so he had agreed, just this once. The job was a setup. Marshall Thompson, a man with a porcine face and a sweaty upper lip, had hired him. He had sworn the Cogans were holed up in an abandoned livery stable at the edge of town, armed but ready to give up. He had insisted on coming along with a few of his own men to assist in the arrest. Luke's gut had told him something was wrong. The marshal was too eager, his eyes too shifty, but the pay was high, and Sam was looking at him with wide, hero-worshipping eyes. Luke had ignored his instincts. He remembered the smell of hot dust and manure as they approached the livery. He remembered telling Sam to stay back, to cover the rear exit, to stay out of the line of fire. He remembered the marshal waving his men forward, his voice a little too loud, a little too confident. The world had exploded in a hailstorm of lead. It was not 2 men ready to surrender. It was the whole Cogan gang, 6 of them, armed to the teeth and waiting for them. It was an ambush. Marshal Thompson and his deputies had not fired a single shot in their defense. They had melted away, vanishing back into the town the moment the shooting started, leaving Luke and his brother pinned down behind a water trough. Luke had fought with a cold, desperate fury, his twin revolvers bucking in his hands. He was a whirlwind of calculated violence, a machine built for this kind of work. But Sam was not. Sam was a dreamer, caught in a nightmare. Luke saw the flash of terror in his brother's eyes, the way he fumbled to reload his rifle. "Stay down! Sam!" Luke had roared over the cacophony of gunfire. But a bullet had torn through the wooden trough, sending a splinter into Sam's arm. He had cried out, more in surprise than pain, and had foolishly risen to his feet. For a single, horrifying second, his silhouette was framed against the bright, unforgiving sky. It was all the time the Cogan brothers needed. A shot rang out, and Sam crumpled to the ground, a dark red flower blooming on his chest. The fight had gone out of Luke then. The cold fury was replaced by a hollow, sickening roar in his ears. He had done the only thing he could. He had grabbed his dying brother, dragging him back, providing cover with his own body, and retreated under a hail of bullets, leaving the bounty and his own soul behind in that dusty street. Sam had died in his arms a few minutes later, his last words a choked, confused whisper. You will tell Mary. You will tell her I was brave. Won't you, Luke? Luke had not been able to answer. He had just held his brother's cooling body, the smell of his blood mingling with the gunpowder, and felt a part of himself die with him. He later learned that Marshal Thompson had a deal with the Cogans. He would lead the famous bounty hunter into a trap, and they would split the bounty the law had placed on their heads. It was a clean, profitable betrayal. Luke had hunted Thompson down a month later, not for a bounty, but for vengeance. He had not killed the man. He had broken him, left him a whimpering wreck in another dusty town, and then he had walked away. He had quit the trade. The law was a lie, and he had sacrificed his brother on its corrupt altar. The guilt was a cancer, eating him from the inside out. He had been drifting ever since, a man without purpose, avoiding connections, because anyone who got close to him seemed to pay a terrible price. He blinked, and the fire in front of him came back into focus. The past receded, leaving behind its bitter taste. Clara was stirring in her bedroll, her face soft in sleep. He looked at her, and the ghost of his brother whispered a warning in his ear. He was getting too close. He was letting her in, and that was dangerous for both of them. The days that followed were a slow, quiet unfolding, as they moved deeper into the wilderness, away from the prying eyes of towns. The landscape softened. They followed a river that cut through a green, fertile valley, a stark contrast to the barren plains they had crossed. The gentle murmur of the water seemed to encourage confession. They would sit by the riverbank in the evenings, the setting sun turning the water to liquid gold. It was here that Clara began to speak not just of the events of her past, a sterile recounting of facts, but of the wounds they had left behind. "Sometimes," she confessed one evening, her voice barely a whisper, "I will feel a shadow pass over the sun, and my skin will crawl. My body remembers being watched. It remembers the feeling of being prey." She hugged her knees to her chest. "I do not think that memory will ever fade. It lives in my bones." Luke listened, his gaze fixed on the current. He did not offer platitudes or empty reassurances. He simply listened, giving her the space to voice the fears that haunted her. When she was done, he picked up a flat stone and skipped it across the water's surface. "Fear is a ghost," he said, his voice low. "You can let it haunt you, or you can learn to walk through it." He looked at her then, his dark eyes serious. "You are not prey. Not anymore." His own story came out in a similar fashion, in fragments, shared under the vast, star-dusted canopy of the night sky. He never told her the whole story of Sam, of the betrayal. The wound was too deep, too raw to be exposed completely, but he spoke of a failure, a terrible mistake that had cost him everything. "I was supposed to protect him," he said one night, staring up at the constellations. "He was younger. He trusted me, and I led him into hell." He paused, the silence stretching between them. "I have been running from that ever since. From the man I was—" Clara heard the raw, aching guilt in his voice. It was a mirror to her own shame, a different wound from a different weapon, but the pain was the same. She saw that this hard, self-sufficient man was as haunted as she was. He was not just a protector. He was a penitent, living out a self-imposed exile. In his admission of failure, she found a strange comfort. She was not the only one with a past that clung to her like a shroud. They were two broken halves of a whole, each recognizing the cracks in the other. Their bond, forged in the crucible of shared pain and quiet understanding, deepened into something fragile and precious. The space between them on the horse grew smaller. Sometimes, when the trail was rough, she would lean back against his chest, and he would not stiffen. His arm would steady her, his touch firm and reassuring. One night, the air was crisp and cold, and the fire seemed to burn brighter than usual, a lone beacon of warmth in the immense, silent darkness. They had eaten their meager meal of roasted rabbit and were sitting in a comfortable silence, watching the flames dance. Clara looked at Luke, at the way the firelight carved deep shadows into the rugged landscape of his face. He was staring into the flames, but she knew he was not seeing them. He was seeing ghosts. "Luke," she said softly. He turned his head, his dark eyes focusing on her. She took a breath, the confession rising in her throat. A truth so raw and honest it terrified her. "I want to thank you," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "For everything. For stopping that day. For not leaving me." She looked down at her hands, twisting them in her lap. "For a long time, my body has only known fear. When a man comes near me, it remembers. It braces for pain." She looked up, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "But when you are near, it is different. My body still remembers to be afraid. But my heart," she faltered, searching for the words. "My heart feels safe. For the first time in so long, I feel safe." Her words were a balm on his wounded soul. He had spent years believing he was a harbinger of death, a man whose presence brought ruin. To be seen as a source of safety, of peace, was a gift he had never expected to receive. He saw the vulnerability in her eyes, the tremulous trust she was placing in him, and it moved him in a way he had not been moved in years. "I have never wanted to save anyone before," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he could not name. He had saved himself, over and over. He had rescued bounties from their own stupidity, only to turn them over for cash. But he had never felt this pull, this profound, elemental need to shield another person from the world's cruelty. "I am not a good man. Clara." "You are a good man to me," she whispered. He reached across the small space between them, his calloused fingers gently touching her cheek. Her skin was soft, and she leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering closed. He saw the flicker of purpose in the darkness of his own life, a single, guiding star in a black and empty sky. "Maybe," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I was meant to save you." He leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. He was not going to be like the others. He was not going to take anything from her. He was going to give her a choice. Her eyes opened, wide and searching. She did not pull away. He closed the distance between them, his lips meeting hers. The kiss was not born of passion, but of a deep, aching tenderness. It was hesitant, gentle, a quiet question. Her lips were soft, and for a moment, she responded, a small, sighing sound escaping her. It was a kiss of shared sorrows, of mutual comfort, of two lonely souls finding a moment of solace in the wilderness. But then her body betrayed her. A violent tremor ran through her entire frame. She gasped, her hands flying up to his chest, pushing him away. Her eyes were wide with a blind, panicked terror, the ghosts of Blackwater Gulch rising up to claim her. "I am sorry," she stammered, scrambling backwards, away from him, away from the touch. I cannot. Luke immediately drew back, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. There was no anger in his eyes, no frustration, only a deep, profound understanding. He saw the war raging inside her, the battle between her heart and her history. "It is all right," he said, his voice gentle. He did not move closer, giving her the space she needed. "There is nothing to be sorry for." He held her gaze, his own steady and unwavering. "I will wait," he said simply. And she knew he meant it. He would wait until her heart won the war. A few days later, following the curve of the river, they stumbled upon it, tucked away in a small, sheltered meadow, half hidden by a stand of aspen trees. Was an abandoned cabin. It was small and rough-hewn, its timber roof sagging in one corner, but its stone chimney was intact, and its walls looked solid. A small canyon opened up behind it, a sheer wall of red rock that protected it from the wind. It was a place of profound peace. They decided, without ever really discussing it, to stay. The horse needed to rest. Their supplies were running low. and the thought of a solid roof over their heads, even a leaking one, was a luxury neither of them could resist. The first few days were spent in a quiet flurry of domesticity. Luke patched the roof with fresh timber and mud, his axe ringing through the clear mountain air. He shored up the sagging porch and cleared the chimney of a bird's nest. Clara, meanwhile, swept the cabin clean of years of dust and leaves. She found a rusty bucket and scrubbed the floorboards until the pale wood shone. She washed their clothes in the river and hung them on a line to dry in the sun. Behind the cabin, she found the ghost of a garden, a small, rectangular plot of earth still discernible by the rotted wooden borders. An idea took root in her mind. Using a sharpened stick, she began to break up the hard, dry soil, pulling weeds, turning the earth over and over, preparing it for a life it had not known in years. Luke, seeing her work, took a day to build a simple fence around the plot, a rough but sturdy barrier to keep out deer and rabbits. They worked in a comfortable, easy rhythm, often without speaking, each understanding their role in carving out this small sanctuary for themselves. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch of their borrowed home and watch the sun set behind the canyon wall, painting the red rocks in fiery hues. One evening, as Clara looked at the small patch of turned earth, a feeling of hope, so alien it was almost painful, bloomed in her chest. For the first time since she had left her family's farm years ago, she had planted something. She had put something into the earth with the expectation of a future, of a harvest. She looked at the sturdy little cabin, at the new fence Luke had built, at the man himself, sitting quietly beside her, and allowed herself to imagine a life she had never thought possible, a life where she was not running, a life where she was not defined by what had been done to her, a life where she could choose her own future, right here, in this quiet, peaceful place. The thought was fragile, delicate as a new sprout, but it was there, and for the first time, it felt real. The peace they found in the small canyon was a fragile, precious thing, like a wildflower blooming in the crack of a rock. For a few weeks, the world was reduced to the size of their hidden meadow. Their days fell into a rhythm dictated by the sun. Mornings were for work. Luke would hunt or chop wood. The steady thud of his axe, a reassuring heartbeat in the quiet air. Clara tended to her small, hopeful garden, her fingers finding a forgotten comfort in the feel of cool, dark earth. She coaxed life from the soil, tiny green shoots that felt like a personal victory against the barrenness of her past. In this small, protected world, she began to heal. The haunted look in her eyes was replaced by a quiet watchfulness. The tension in her shoulders eased. They spoke more, their conversations meandering like the river that flowed nearby. They shared stories of their childhoods, small, mundane memories that painted pictures of lives before they were broken. Luke spoke of fishing with his father, of the brother he had loved, though he never spoke of how he had lost him. Clara spoke of her mother's apple pies, of the way the light looked coming through the windows of their small farmhouse in the east. They were building a history together, one quiet moment at a time. But the wilderness had eyes. A grizzled old prospector, leading a stubborn mule, stumbled upon their canyon one afternoon. He was a harmless creature, his mind half-addled by sun and solitude, and they shared their fire and a portion of their meal with him. He took in the sight of the big, quiet man and the young, pretty woman with a toothless grin, asked no questions, and was on his way by morning. A week later, he wandered into the town of Providence, and in exchange for a bottle of whiskey, he told a story to a rapt saloon audience about a strange couple living in an old abandoned cabin up by the Red Rock Canyon. He mentioned a man who looked like he could handle himself, and a woman with hair the color of corn silk. News travels on the wind in the west, and the wind blew south. It blew all the way to Redemption Creek, where it found the ears of a town still simmering with self-righteous indignation. It found the ears of Reverend Harlan. For the preacher, the news was a threat. Clara's disappearance with an unknown man undermined the narrative he had so carefully crafted. He had painted her as a fallen woman, a deceiver. But if she had been taken, abducted by some rough drifter. Then she became a victim. Pity could replace judgment, and questions might be asked. Questions about his own role in the affair, about the truth of her past, about the money that had exchanged hands with the Stone family. His reputation, his very position in the town, depended on her remaining the villain of the story. Standing at his pulpit the following Sunday, his face a mask of pious sorrow, he spun a new tale. He spoke of the poor, misguided Clara, a lamb led astray from the fold. He spoke of a dark, violent man, a drifter he had seen lurking on the edge of town, who had preyed upon her vulnerability and abducted her. He painted Luke Morgan, a man he had never met, as a devil incarnate, a kidnapper who had stolen the town's chance to save a fallen soul. "We must restore this child to the path of righteousness," he thundered, his voice ringing with false conviction. "We must deliver her from the clutches of this sinner." To that end, he declared, he was using his own modest funds to place a bounty on the head of the man known only as Luke. $50 for his capture. It was a masterstroke. It was not a bounty for a criminal, but a reward for a rescue, an act of Christian charity. It sanctified the pursuit. Jebediah Stone, sitting in the front pew with his parents, felt a surge of humiliated rage. The town whispered about him, the man who had almost married soiled goods. The idea that this woman, his intended property, was now with some other man, some nameless ruffian, was an intolerable insult to his pride. He would get her back, not to marry her, but to see her punished, to see his family's honor restored. He was the first to volunteer for the posse, his face set in a grim, determined line. And so they rode out, a grim procession of a dozen men, led by a preacher and a jilted groom. They were not a posse of lawmen, but a mob fueled by pride, prejudice, and the promise of a small reward. They were the righteous, coming to reclaim what they saw as theirs. The peace in the canyon was shattered on a moonless night. Luke, whose senses were honed by years of living on the edge, was the first to feel the change. His horse, picketed in the meadow, grew restless, its ears twitching, its whinnies low and nervous. Luke was on his feet in an instant, his hand reaching for the revolver he always kept close. "What is it?" Clara whispered from the doorway of the cabin, her heart beginning to pound. "Get inside and stay down," he ordered, his voice a low, urgent command. He moved into the darkness of the porch, melting into the shadows, his eyes scanning the tree line at the edge of the meadow. For a long moment, there was only the sound of the crickets and the whisper of the wind. Then, a twig snapped in the darkness. It was a small sound, but in the profound silence of the night, it was as loud as a thunderclap. The first gunshot was a flash of orange fire from the trees, the bullet splintering the wooden door frame just inches from where Clara had been standing. She screamed, stumbling back into the cabin and dropping to the floor, her hands flying to her head. The night erupted into chaos. More shots rang out, the bullets thudding into the timber walls of the cabin. Luke returned fire, his shots measured and precise. Not a wild spray of bullets, but a calculated response aimed at the muzzle flashes in the darkness. "Abductor!" a voice roared from the trees. It was the voice of Reverend Harlan. "Release the woman and you will not be harmed. We have come to save her soul." "Stay back," Luke yelled, his voice a gravelly roar that cut through the gunfire. "She is not your concern." Clara, huddled on the floor, felt a cold, familiar terror seize her. They had come for her, the preacher, the town, her past. It had hunted her down. She was trapped. She saw Luke reload his weapon with a calm, deadly efficiency, his face a grim mask in the flickering firelight from the hearth. He was a different man now, the quiet protector transformed into the lethal hunter he had once been. He moved from the porch to a window, firing a single shot that was answered by a cry of pain from the darkness. He was trying to protect her. He was putting his life on the line for her. The thought cut through her terror with a sharp, clarifying pang. Another volley of shots peppered the front of the cabin. Luke grunted, stumbling back from the window. "Luke!" she cried, scrambling towards him. "I am all right," he gritted out, but she saw the dark stain spreading across his left shoulder. He leaned against the wall, his face pale. "We have to get out of here. Through the back." He fired 2 more shots towards the front to give them cover, then grabbed her hand, his grip surprisingly strong. "The canyon wall. There are caves. We can hide there." He kicked open the back door, and they plunged into the night. The shooting from the front of the cabin intensified as the posse realized they were fleeing. Men began to circle around the sides of the cabin. They ran across the small meadow towards the dark, looming shape of the canyon. The air was filled with the whistle of bullets and the shouts of angry men. Luke was slowing, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his arm pressed against his bleeding shoulder. A figure emerged from the darkness to their right, blocking their path to the canyon. It was Jebediah Stone, his face contorted with a righteous fury, a rifle in his hands. "There you are," he snarled, his eyes fixing on Clara. He raised the rifle. Luke shoved Clara behind him, shielding her with his own body. He brought his revolver up, but he was a second too slow. Jebediah fired. The bullet, meant for Clara, slammed into Luke's side. He cried out, a raw, guttural sound of agony, and crumpled to his knees. His revolver fell from his nerveless fingers, landing in the dirt. For a moment, the world stood still. Jebediah, shocked by his own actions, stared at the man he had just shot. Clara looked at Luke, on the ground, bleeding, and something inside her broke. It was not the fragile hope she had been nurturing. It was the last remnants of the terrified girl from Blackwater Gulch. In its place rose a fierce, primal rage. She did not think, she acted. She dove for Luke's revolver, her fingers closing around the cold, heavy steel. She had never held a gun before in her life. Jebediah was fumbling to reload. His eyes wide, she scrambled to her feet, holding the heavy weapon in both hands, and pointed it at him. "Get away from him!" she shrieked, her voice a sound she did not recognize. Jebediah stared at her, at the wild, feral look in her eyes, at the big revolver in her small hands. He hesitated. From the side, another man from the posse was running towards them, leveling his own pistol. "Drop it, girl!" he yelled. Clara did not even look at him. Her world had narrowed to 2 people, the man on the ground she loved and the man who had hurt him. But the attacker was closer now, a more immediate threat. She swung the heavy gun towards him, her hands trembling so violently she could barely aim. She squeezed the trigger. The explosion was deafening, the recoil slamming her backwards. The man yelped and fell, clutching his leg. She had not killed him, but she had stopped him. The moment of hesitation was all the time she needed. She turned back to Jebediah, who was still staring, dumbfounded. Then she turned to Luke. "We have to go," she said, her voice shaking but urgent. She grabbed him under his good arm, trying to pull him up. "Luke, please, you have to get up." He was a dead weight, his face slick with sweat. "Go!" he rasped. "Save yourself, Clara." "No," she said, her voice fierce. "Not without you." With a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength, she hauled him to his feet. He leaned on her heavily, his legs barely holding him. She wrapped his good arm around her shoulder, retrieved his revolver, and began to drag him towards the sheer rock face of the canyon. The posse was regrouping, shouting in the darkness. She did not look back. She focused only on the next step, on the dead weight of the man beside her, on the rough, dark wall of rock that promised safety. She found a narrow crevice, a dark slash in the rock face almost hidden by thorny bushes. She half dragged, half pushed Luke's limp body inside. It was not a cave, more of a deep fissure in the rock, barely wide enough for the 2 of them. It was dark and cold, and it smelled of damp earth. She collapsed beside him, her body shaking uncontrollably. the heavy revolver still clutched in her hand. Outside, she could hear the angry voices of the posse as they searched the meadow, their lanterns bobbing in the darkness like malevolent fireflies. She held her breath, listening to the sound of her own heart hammering against her ribs, and waited for what felt like an eternity. She tended to him in the suffocating darkness of their hiding place. Luke was fading, his body burning with fever from the 2 wounds. He drifted in and out of consciousness, his words a delirious mumble. She tore strips from her own petticoat, pressing them against the wounds in his shoulder and side to stanch the bleeding. The fabric quickly became soaked with his blood. Her terror was a cold, hard knot in her stomach, but her determination was a fire that burned hotter. She would not let him die. She had been weak her whole life, a victim of circumstance, a pawn in the games of cruel men. Not anymore. She felt a profound, seismic shift within herself. The fear was still there, but it was no longer in control. When the sounds of the posse faded, she knew she had to act. They needed water. She crept from their hiding place, her senses on high alert, every shadow a potential enemy. She found the river, her hands cupping the cold, life-giving water, and carried it back to him in Luke's hat. She dribbled the water onto his parched lips, bathed his feverish forehead with a strip of damp cloth. She cleaned his wounds as best she could, her stomach churning at the sight of the torn flesh. Using the small knife from Luke's belt, she carefully cut the bullets out, her hands surprisingly steady. It was a brutal, bloody business, and she worked by the faint light of the rising moon, tears of fear and concentration streaming down her face. She sewed the wounds shut with a needle and thread from her small mending kit, her stitches clumsy but tight. She fashioned a new bandage from the last of her petticoat. As she worked, she whispered to him, her voice a low, constant murmur. "You are not going to die. I will not let you die." She laid her hand on his chest, feeling the faint, fluttering beat of his heart. "I am not weak anymore," she whispered, the words a vow made to him and to herself. She kept them alive for 2 days in that cold, dark crevice. She foraged for edible roots, her meager knowledge gleaned from a book her mother once owned. She kept a constant vigil, Luke's revolver always within reach, her ears straining for any sound of the returning posse. On the 3rd morning, Luke's fever broke. He opened his eyes, the delirium gone, replaced by a weak but lucid gaze. He looked at her tear-stained, dirt-smudged face, at the exhaustion that was etched into every line of her body. He saw the makeshift bandages, the empty hat that had served as a water bucket. He understood what she had done. He tried to speak, his voice a dry, cracking whisper. He lifted a trembling hand, touching her cheek. "I did not save you," he murmured, his voice thick with a raw, humbling emotion. "You saved me." In his eyes, she saw not just gratitude, but a profound and absolute reverence. He was not looking at a victim he had rescued. He was looking at his savior, at an equal. The last wall around her heart, the wall built of fear and shame, crumbled into dust. She leaned down, her lips touching his. The kiss was as soft as a prayer. All the terror, all the pain, all the unspoken feelings of the past weeks poured into that single, gentle touch. He responded weakly, his hand cupping the back of her head, his fingers tangling in her hair. That night, as the moon cast a pale, silver light into their hiding place, their shared ordeal and quiet confessions blossomed into a new, profound intimacy. It was slow and hesitant and achingly tender. It was a joining not just of bodies, but of souls that had been broken and were now, finally, beginning to heal each other. His touch was not a violation, but a question, a reverence. Her response was not one of fear, but of an absolute and unwavering trust. It was an act of quiet desperation and profound love, a consecration of their bond in the heart of the wilderness that had almost claimed them. Afterwards, she lay curled in his good arm, her head resting on his chest, listening to the slow, steady rhythm of his heart. Tears streamed silently down her face, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of release, of a homecoming she had never known. She lifted her head, looking at him in the moonlight. "I am not the virgin bride they wanted," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. The words were not an apology, but a statement of fact, a declaration of her true self. "But I am still a bride," she said, her voice breaking on a sob. "If you will have me." His words were a vow, her acceptance a sacrament whispered in the cold moonlight of a mountain cave. They were not bound by a preacher or a law, but by something far stronger, the shared conviction that they had been reborn in the crucible of their escape. His name, spoken from her lips, was a prayer. Her name, spoken from his, was a promise. They were Luke and Clara, and that was all the identity they needed. They left the canyon at the first light of dawn, Luke still weak, his movements stiff and pained, but his resolve as hard as the granite cliffs they left behind. Clara had fashioned a sling for his arm from the remnants of her dress, and he rode with his jaw set against the jolting pain. She rode behind him now, her arms wrapped firmly around his waist, her body a shield for his wounded back. Their roles had shifted, the lines between protector and protected blurring into a seamless partnership. They were a single entity, moving north towards the vast, unknown territories where a name like Morgan or a story like hers might be swallowed by the sheer scale of the wilderness. They were chasing anonymity, a place where they could be nothing more than a man and a woman building a life from scratch. The journey was slow, governed by the pace of Luke's healing. They followed game trails and the whispers of forgotten streams, avoiding towns and well-traveled roads. In the quiet solitude of the trail, a new, gentle rhythm settled between them. Clara's touch was no longer hesitant. She would tend to his wounds each evening with a confident, soothing grace, her fingers tracing the angry, stitched lines of his flesh not with pity, but with a fierce, proprietary tenderness. He, in turn, would watch her, his gaze filled with a quiet awe that went beyond gratitude. He was seeing the woman she was becoming, the woman she had perhaps always been, buried beneath layers of fear and sorrow. It was in the foothills of the Bighorn Mountains that they found her. She was a small, darting shadow in the twilight, no more than 10 years old, with eyes as black and wild as a cornered hawk. She was Apache, her thin cotton dress torn and her feet bare, but she held herself with a fierce, unyielding pride. She was hiding in a thicket of chokecherry bushes, trying to snare a rabbit with a crude, makeshift trap. Clara saw her first. She reined their horse to a stop, her hand on Luke's arm. "Wait," she whispered. Before they could move, 2 figures on horseback crashed through the undergrowth. They were trappers, rough men with greedy eyes and the stench of stale whiskey and unwashed bodies clinging to them. They were laughing, a cruel, ugly sound in the peaceful evening air. "There she is," one of them shouted, pointing a dirty finger at the thicket. "Cornered now, you little heathen!" The girl froze, her small body rigid with terror. Luke's hand instinctively went to his revolver, his expression hardening into a dangerous mask. But a new reality held him back. He was still injured, his draw-hand shoulders stiff and unreliable. A gunfight against 2 armed men was a fool's gamble. "We should ride on," he said in a low voice meant for Clara alone. "This is not our fight." Clara looked at the girl, so small and alone, her dark eyes wide with the same terror Clara had known her entire life. She saw a reflection of herself, a child preyed upon by brutal men, her life considered a commodity to be bought and sold. The trappers were already dismounting, their intentions a vile poison in the air. One of them uncoiled a rope from his saddle. Something inside Clara broke free. It was not fear, it was a white-hot, protective fury. All the pain, all the humiliation, all the terror she had ever felt coalesced into a single, unshakable conviction. "No," she said, her voice quiet but ringing with the clarity of a steel blade. She slid from the horse's back before Luke could stop her. "We are not leaving her." She walked forward, placing herself between the trappers and the girl. Luke cursed under his breath, his hand tightening on his gun, and moved the horse to stand beside her, a silent, menacing wall of support. The trappers stopped, surprised by this sudden intervention. They looked from Clara's determined face to Luke's grim one. "This ain't your concern, ma'am," the taller one sneered, his eyes raking over her with insolent appraisal. "Just a runaway stray we aim to return for a reward." "She is not an animal to be returned," Clara said, her voice steady and cold. "She is a child, and she is with us. You will leave her be." The man laughed. "Is that so? Last I checked, the law does not much care what happens to her kind. Now step aside." He took a step forward. Luke drew his revolver. The movement was slower than it once would have been, a testament to his injury. But the click of the hammer being cocked was loud and final in the tense silence. "You heard the lady." Luke's voice was a low growl. "Step aside yourself." The trappers exchanged a look. They were armed, but they had not counted on a fight. They saw the cold certainty in Luke's eyes, the unyielding resolve in Clara's, and they weighed the price of a small girl against the price of a bullet. With a string of muttered curses, they remounted their horses and rode away, casting hateful glances over their shoulders. When they were gone, Clara turned and slowly approached the thicket. She knelt, making herself small, unthreatening. The Apache girl stared at her, her eyes narrowed with suspicion and fear. Clara did not speak. She simply held out her hand, palm up, an offering of peace. For a long, silent minute, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the girl crept from the bushes and placed her small, trembling hand in Clara's. In that moment, Clara's transformation was complete. She was no longer a survivor. She was a guardian. They called the girl Nita, the closest they could come to the name she whispered to them in her own tongue. She was a silent, watchful presence, her trauma a palpable cloak around her. But under Clara's patient care, she began to unfurl. Clara, who had never had anyone to care for, discovered a deep, untapped well of maternal instinct within herself. She taught Nita not with words, but with actions. She showed her how to stitch a straight seam, their heads bent together over a piece of cloth, Clara's gentle hands guiding Nita's small ones. She taught her how to approach a horse, to speak to it in a low, soothing murmur, to read the language of its twitching ears and swishing tail. She taught her the art of stillness, of how to hide in plain sight, to use the landscape as a shield, to melt into the shadows of rocks and trees. These were the lessons of survival, the lessons Clara herself had learned through pain and fear, but which she now passed on as gifts of strength and empowerment. Luke watched it all with a growing sense of wonder. He saw Clara's voice, once a timid whisper, become a source of calm and authority. He saw her face, once a mask of fear, soften with a love that was fierce and unconditional. He watched her one afternoon, braiding Nita's long, black hair, humming a soft, forgotten lullaby, and his heart ached with a love so profound it almost frightened him. He had fallen in love with a survivor, a woman he sought to protect. But the woman before him now was a force of nature, a creator of safety, a builder of lives. His love for her was no longer just about protection. It was about a deep and abiding admiration. Their fragile peace was not destined to last. Luke's past had a long shadow, and it had finally caught up with them. A man named Silas Kane, a former rival from Luke's bounty hunting days, had heard the whispers of the $50 bounty on a man who fit Luke's description. Kane was a hired gun, a man with a jackal's smile and eyes as dead as stones. Years ago, Luke had outmaneuvered him on a job, costing Kane a significant bounty and, more importantly, his pride. Kane had been nursing the grudge ever since, waiting for a chance at revenge. The $50 was an insult, but the opportunity to settle the score with Luke Morgan was priceless. Kane was a better tracker than any town preacher or jilted groom. He and his 2 men picked up their trail outside Providence and followed them with a relentless, patient cunning. They caught up to them in a stretch of badlands, a desolate maze of canyons and rock spires. Luke sensed they were being followed a day before they were seen. He felt it in the prickle on his neck, in the unnatural silence of the birds. "We have company," he said to Clara, his voice grim. "3 riders, and they are not lost." They found shelter in a dilapidated line shack, a 1-room cabin perched precariously on a hillside, overlooking a steep, rock-strewn gully. It was a poor place to make a stand, but it was all they had. Kane's attack was swift and brutal. They were pinned down by a relentless barrage of rifle fire just after dawn. Luke, his shoulder still not fully healed, returned fire, but his movements were hampered, his aim less certain. A bullet ricocheted off the stone chimney, sending a spray of rock fragments into the cabin. One sharp piece struck Luke in the head, just above his temple. He staggered back, a bloody gash opening on his forehead, his vision blurring. He stumbled and fell, his gun clattering to the floor. "Luke!" Clara screamed. Crawling to his side, he was conscious, but dazed, the world swimming before his eyes. Outside, Silas Kane's triumphant laugh echoed. "It is over. Morgan, I finally have you. Send the woman and the girl out, and I might make it quick for you." Clara looked at Luke, pale and bleeding on the floor. She looked at Nita, huddled in the corner, her small face a mask of terror. And she looked at the single and grime-covered window that overlooked the gully behind the shack. The fire she had felt when she protected Nita now roared into a blazing inferno. She would not be a victim. She would not let her family be destroyed. Her mind raced, clear and cold as ice. She saw not a trap, but an opportunity. "Nita," she said, her voice sharp and clear, cutting through the child's fear. "Listen to me. Do you remember the game we played, the one about hiding?" Nita nodded, her eyes wide. "When I tell you to, you will run out the back. You will slide down into that gully and you will follow it until it is safe. You will not stop, and you will not look back. Do you understand?" Nita nodded again, her small body trembling but her gaze locked on Clara's. Clara turned to Luke, pressing his revolver into his hand. "Can you shoot?" He blinked, trying to clear his vision. "Clara, what are you doing?" "I am ending this," she said, her voice devoid of any fear. She grabbed a half-empty bottle of kerosene from a shelf, one left behind by the shack's previous occupant. She tore a strip of cloth from her sleeve and stuffed it into the neck of the bottle. "They think we are trapped. They think we are waiting to die." She moved to the back of the cabin, staying low, below the window. She could hear Kane and his men moving closer, their boots crunching on the gravel outside. "This cabin is old. The wood is dry as bone," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "It will go up like a torch." She uncorked their last canteen of water and poured it on the floor around Luke and Nita. "It will not stop the fire, but it might buy you time." She looked at Luke, her eyes blazing. "When the fire starts, they will be confused. They will look at the flames, not at the gully. That is when you send her." She lit the kerosene-soaked rag with a match from the hearth. The flames sputtered to life. "I am going to draw them to the front." Before he could protest, she scrambled to the front of the cabin. "We surrender!" she screamed, her voice high and panicked, a perfect imitation of a terrified woman. "Do not shoot! I am coming out!" She heard Kane's surprised grunt. Well, a sensible woman. Clara took a deep breath, the bottle heavy in her hand. She hurled it through the front window. It shattered against the dry timber of the porch, and the world erupted in a whoosh of orange flame. As Kane and his men swore in surprise and anger, scrambling back from the sudden inferno, Clara was already moving. She grabbed a spare rifle from the wall, a heavy Winchester, and crawled to the side window. The shack was filling with thick, choking smoke. "Now, Luke, now!" she screamed. Through the smoke, she saw Luke shove Nita out the back door. The small girl slid into the gully and vanished, just as Clara had taught her. One of Kane's men, recovering from the shock of the fire, started to move around the side of the burning cabin. Clara rested the rifle on the windowsill, took aim as Luke had shown her, and fired. The man cried out and fell. The front door, now engulfed in flames, collapsed inwards. Silas Kane appeared through the fire and smoke, a demonic silhouette, his face a mask of incandescent rage. He saw Luke struggling to get to his feet and raised his pistol. Clara fired again. The shot was true. Kane staggered, a look of profound disbelief on his face. He clutched his chest, his pistol falling from his hand. He looked at her, this woman who was supposed to be a helpless pawn, and then he collapsed, consumed by the smoke and flames. The last man, seeing his leader fall, fired one last panicked shot before turning and running for his life. The smoke was a thick, black poison, stealing the air from their lungs. Clara rushed to Luke, hauling him to his feet. "Come on," she choked, pulling him towards the back door. They stumbled out of the inferno and half fell, half slid down into the gully, gulping in the clean, cool air as the cabin burned on the hillside above them, a funeral pyre for the ghosts of their past. When they were a safe distance away, they collapsed, coughing and gasping for breath. Clara held Luke, checking his head wound, her hands shaking now that the fight was over. He was alive. They were all alive. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain, shock, and overwhelming love. He saw the soot on her face, the wild look in her eyes, the raw, indomitable power that radiated from her. He reached up, his hand stroking her cheek, his thumb wiping away a smudge of ash. He took her in his arms, holding her tightly, burying his face in her hair. He breathed in the scent of her, smoke and grit and courage. "You were never someone to be owned," he said, his voice thick with emotion, his words a revelation that had been dawning on him for weeks and was now blindingly clear. "You are fire!" He pulled back, his hands framing her face, his gaze locking with hers. "And I will follow you anywhere." They found a home for Nita with a small band of Shoshone who were wintering in the Wind River Range. It was a difficult parting, filled with silent tears and the tight embrace of a child who had found a mother and a woman who had found a daughter. Clara gave Nita a small sewing kit, a replica of her own, and a finely stitched leather pouch to keep it in. Nita, in turn, pressed a small, smooth river stone into Clara's palm, a stone she'd carried since her own family was lost. It was a promise of remembrance, a token of a bond that transcended blood. As they rode away, Clara watched until Nita's small figure, standing beside a woman from the tribe who had taken her in, disappeared from view. Her heart ached with the loss, but it was an ache of love, not of sorrow. She had not abandoned the girl. She had delivered her to a safe harbor, a future where she could be whole. She had given Nita the one thing she herself had never been granted, a choice. The act of releasing Nita into a better life solidified a resolve that had been hardening in Clara's soul since the night the cabin burned. Running had saved her life, but it had not given her a life. Every town would hold a potential shopkeeper with a cruel word, every stranger a potential judge. The ghost of Reverend Harlan, the brand of Jebediah Stone, the whispers of Redemption Creek. They were chains she would drag behind her forever unless she turned and faced them. Her past was not a destination she could outride. It was a battle she had to win. One morning, as they watered their horse in a clear, cold stream, she turned to Luke. The gash on his head had healed into a thin, white scar, a permanent reminder of their fight. His wounds were no longer a source of pain, but a map of their shared history. "I am going back," she said. It was not a question or a proposal. It was a statement of fact. Luke looked at her, his dark eyes searching her face. He saw no fear there, only a calm, unwavering determination. He had known this moment was coming. He had seen the fire in her transform from a desperate spark of survival into a steady, consuming flame of resolve. He had sent a letter weeks ago from a small trading post, addressed to a name he had not spoken in years, a federal marshal out of Cheyenne, one of the few honest lawmen he had ever known. He had told the man a story of corruption and trafficking, of a preacher in a town called Redemption Creek. He had not known if the letter would ever arrive, or if it would be heeded. He had simply planted the seed and hoped that justice, for once, might grow. "I know," he said. He did not try to dissuade her. To do so would be to deny the very woman he had come to love. "When do we leave?" Her answer was to mount the horse. Now. Redemption Creek looked smaller than she remembered, the buildings more crooked, the dust in the street a more pathetic shade of brown. It was a place shrunken by her own growth. She rode into town not on the back of Luke's horse, but on a mare she had bought herself. Her back straight, her head held high. She had traded her plain calico for a dark riding skirt and a simple blue blouse, the clothes of a woman with a purpose. Not a victim. She had asked Luke to wait for her on the ridge outside of town. This was her fight. She had to stand on her own 2 feet, face her demons alone. He had agreed, his hand lingering on hers for a moment before she rode away, his eyes telling her everything his words did not need to. She dismounted not in front of the church, the site of her humiliation, but in front of the saloon, the grimy, beating heart of the town's hypocrisy. It was mid-afternoon, and the place was half full of ranchers, drifters, and town loafers, their voices a low hum of gossip and complaint. She pushed through the swinging doors, and the hum died instantly. Every head turned, every eye fixed on her. They saw not the trembling, white-clad girl who had run barefoot from their judgment, but a woman whose gaze was as steady and sharp as a drawn blade. She ignored them, her eyes scanning the room, and then she saw him. Reverend Harlan was sitting at a corner table, sharing a bottle of whiskey with Elias Stone. The patriarch's face was as hard as ever, but the preacher looked different outside the confines of his church. He looked smaller, his piety a cheap suit that did not fit him in the harsh light of the saloon. He saw her, and for a second, his jovial expression froze. A flicker of something, surprise, then fear, crossed his face before he masked it with a bluff, condescending smile. He rose to his feet, dabbing his lips with a napkin. "Clara, my child," he said, his voice oozing a false, paternal warmth for the benefit of his audience. "You have returned to the fold. We were so worried. We feared that brute had harmed you." Clara walked slowly towards his table, her boots making a soft, deliberate sound on the dusty floorboards. The silence in the saloon was absolute, thick with anticipation. "I was never your child," she said, her voice clear and carrying to every corner of the room. "And the only brute I have ever known is you." A collective gasp went through the room. Elias Stone's eyes narrowed into slits. Harlan's face flushed a deep, mottled red. "Now, Clara," he said, his voice taking on a warning edge. "Grief can do terrible things to a young woman's mind. You are confused." "My mind has never been clearer. Reverend," she said, stopping a few feet from his table. She looked him directly in the eye, and he was the first to look away. She had him. She then turned her gaze to the rest of the room, her voice rising, filled with a power they had never heard from her before. "This man did not save me. He found me. Yes, he found a desperate, starving girl who had survived a horror you cannot imagine. And he did not see a soul to be saved. He saw an opportunity. He saw a commodity to be sold." Jebediah Stone, who had been standing at the bar, pushed his way forward, his face a mask of fury. "That is a lie! You deceived us all!" "I did not deceive you," Clara said, turning her piercing gaze on him. "He did. He coached me. He taught me what to say, how to act. He created a pure, untouched bride for you out of my pain. He sold my silence and your father's pride for a place at your table and a share of your wealth." Elias Stone slammed his fist on the table. "Enough of this slander. This woman is a whore, and she is a liar." "Am I?" Clara's voice was dangerously quiet. She looked past the Stones, past the preacher, to the faces of the other women in the room. There were only a few. The saloon keeper's wife, a few women who worked in the general store. Am I the only one? Am I the only girl Reverend Harlan has saved? The only orphan he has found a respectable, wealthy home for? She saw a flicker of recognition in the eyes of Martha Stone, who stood near the doorway, her face pale. She saw the saloon keeper's wife exchange a nervous glance with another woman. They knew. They had heard the whispers, seen the other girls who had passed through the preacher's care and then conveniently disappeared into good marriages in other territories. "What about the little Miller girl?" a woman's voice called out from the back. "The one whose parents died of the fever. The preacher sent her to live with a cousin back east. We never heard from her again." "And what of Sarah?" another woman added, her voice trembling but determined. It was the blacksmith's wife. "My own niece. He arranged her marriage to that miner up in the silver camps. A man twice her age. We received one letter, and then nothing." A murmur went through the crowd. The seeds of doubt had been planted. The townspeople were looking at the preacher differently now, not as their spiritual guide, but as a man with secrets. Harlan's face was slick with sweat, his eyes darting around like a cornered rat. "These are the hysterical ramblings of disappointed women," he blustered, his voice cracking. "This girl is a liar, a temptress sent by the devil to test our faith." "The only devil in this room is you, Harlan," a low voice said from the doorway. Luke stood there, his large frame filling the entrance. He was not dressed for a fight. He was calm, his hands resting loosely at his sides, but his presence was a physical weight that shifted the balance of power in the room. He walked to Clara's side, a silent, unshakable pillar of support. He did not look at Harlan or the Stones. He looked only at Clara, his eyes filled with a fierce, unwavering pride. Clara felt a surge of strength from his presence. She turned back to Jebediah, to his father, to the whole silent, watching town. "You wanted a virgin," she said, her voice ringing with the truth of her journey, the truth of her becoming. "A blank page for you to write your name on. You wanted something pure and untouched." She took a deep breath, standing tall and straight, her spirit unbowed. "But I became something stronger." The saloon doors swung open again. A tall man with a weathered face and a silver star pinned to his vest stepped inside. He was followed by 2 deputies. His gaze swept the room, taking in the scene with a calm, professional authority. "Reverend Harlan?" the marshal asked, his voice polite but edged with steel. Harlan's face went ashen. He looked from the marshal to Luke. An understanding dawned in his terrified eyes. "I am U.S. Marshal Bassett," the man said, pulling a folded piece of paper from his coat pocket. "I have a warrant for your arrest on federal charges of human trafficking." He nodded at his deputies. "Take him." Harlan sputtered, protesting his innocence, calling on God and the Stones to defend him. But no one moved. His power, built on a foundation of lies and hypocrisy, had crumbled to dust. The townspeople watched in stunned silence as the deputies took him by the arms and led him away. His pious mask finally stripped off, revealing the pathetic, greedy man beneath. Elias and Jebediah Stone stood frozen, their faces a mixture of fury and utter humiliation. Their honor, which they had been so desperate to protect, was now a public joke. They had been duped by a charlatan and bested by the very woman they had scorned. Without another word, they turned and stalked from the saloon, the eyes of the entire town following them. In the silence that followed, Clara looked at the faces of the people who had judged her. She saw not disgust now, but shame. She saw pity, and in some, a dawning respect. She had not come back for their forgiveness. She had come back for her own. Luke took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. "It is over," he whispered. "Yes," she said, a profound sense of peace settling over her. "It is." They walked out of the saloon, out into the clean, bright sunlight, and did not look back. They mounted their horses and rode out of Redemption Creek one last time, leaving the whispers and the judgments behind them in the dust. They rode until the town was just a small, insignificant smudge on the horizon. They were free, finally seen not as the labels the world had tried to pin on them, a ruined woman and a violent drifter, but as who they truly were. They made camp that night on a quiet hillside, under a sky so vast and full of stars it felt like the dawn of a new world. A gentle breeze rustled the tall prairie grass, carrying the scent of sage and clean earth. They sat by a small fire, their shoulders touching, watching the embers glow in the darkness. Luke reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small, cloth-wrapped object. He handed it to her. Clara unwrapped it carefully. Lying in her palm was a ring. It was not gold or silver. It was a simple, dark band of iron, hammered into a perfect circle, its surface smooth and strong. It was beautiful. He took her hand, his thumb gently stroking her palm. "I told myself for a long time that I was not a man who could save anyone," he said, his voice a low, rough murmur. "But from the moment I saw you, shivering in the dark, I wanted to save you." He looked up from her hand, his dark eyes meeting hers, and she saw the whole of his heart in them. "I saved you for me, but only if you choose me." Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the starlight into a shimmering haze. They were tears of a joy so profound, so complete, it felt like her heart might burst. She thought of her journey, of the terrified girl in the white dress, of the woman who had faced down her demons in a dusty saloon. She thought of this man, who had seen her not as something broken, but as something to be cherished. He was not offering her protection. He was offering her a partnership, a choice, a future she could build with her own two hands. She smiled through her tears, a radiant, brilliant smile that lit up her whole face. She closed her hand around the strong iron ring, a symbol of everything they had survived, of everything they would become. "I do," she whispered. Thank you for listening to our story at the Wild West Campfire channel. Please comment where you are listening from to connect with others. And do not forget to subscribe and share your thoughts in English.